This is the International Anthony Burgess Foundation Podcast. In this episode, the Burgess Foundation's Andrew Biswell speaks to the writer and journalist Robert McCrum about his new book, Shakespearean. Robert McCrum was the editor-in-chief of Faber and Faber for nearly 20 years and the literary editor of The Observer between 1996 and 2018. His acclaimed memoir, My Year Off, describes his experiences of suffering a severe stroke, after which he discovered that the only words that made sense to him were snatches of Shakespeare. His new book, Shakespearean, finds its beginnings in these personal experiences, but expands into an exploration of Shakespeare's poetry and plays that seeks to understand them within their historical context and explore the secrets of literary inspiration.
Robert, you've said that reading Shakespeare helped you to recover from a serious illness, the stroke you had in 1995. Could you say a bit more about how that worked and what precisely was the engagement with Shakespeare, what you took from his writing that you found helpful in that situation?
I think there are two things here, Andrew, really. First of all, he's somebody who is in his plays is drawn to jeopardy and risk and character in extremis. And if you're convalescent from a serious illness, you are by definition a character in extremis. So there's a sympathy there, and there's an interest in how he addresses that. The other thing is you don't have to read the plays in full to get, as it were, consolation from them, because there'll be individual speeches. There'll be speeches in Hamlet or speeches in Antony and Cleopatra, speeches in Coriolanus, which will speak directly to you, and so you can they're like these little nuggets which you can enjoy. It also, if you're finding it difficult to concentrate, as I did when I was initially recovering, hard to concentrate on a whole book, you can read 3 or 4 pages of Shakespeare, and it's very restorative, actually.
One of the arguments of your book is that Shakespeare is our contemporary. He's a writer who speaks to us in a way that's of our time, not necessarily of his time. And I wonder how you define that timeless quality that you've identified, that you find especially in his plays.
Well, I think it's to do with a variety of themes which I identified in the book. Because in some ways he's also somebody who invented the way in which we see ourselves, and he was really the first poet, playwright, writer who addressed the issue of the self, which we're very familiar with. But in its own day, first of all the sonnets, and then ultimately the breakthrough of Hamlet, which is a play about the self, Hamlet itself, that was absolutely revolutionary. And so, at one level, there are big themes in Shakespeare. That's one very good example. But then another level, there is, as I've said, there's his fascination with risk and danger and characters in extremis. That speaks to us because we know about that. We live in disrupted times, and funnily enough, I was working on the book for the last 2 or 3 years during a time of violence and danger of all sorts globally and financial disturbances. And then the one thing which was missing, which was very much of Shakespeare's time, which is plague, finally turned up this spring. So in a way, I've got a full house now. All the things that he was addressing and was familiar with are things that we're familiar with.
And were you surprised by how relevant the work seemed? As you worked on the book, did things come into focus that perhaps you'd not seen before? Was your sense of that sharpened?
Somebody said that we don't read Shakespeare, he reads us, which is one of those sort of clever phrases, and I'm not sure it means very much, but there's a sense in which he does interrogate. He makes us, he appears to interrogate us. That's really the mystery of his genius. But there's a range of sympathy, there's a range of interest, and there's a range of focus on various kinds of drama, classical drama, which is, as it were, timeless.
Anthony Burgess, as you know, wrote a novel about Shakespeare's love life titled Nothing Like the Sun, and a biography which was published 50 years ago in 1970.
But a very good one. I actually credit. It's a very good book.
Well, it was very good to see you quoting from the novel and the biography. I wanted to ask you how you think Burgess's Shakespeare books stand up after all those years.
Well, I think the fiction Nothing Like the Sun is very entertaining, and it's typically Burgessian. It's sort of slightly mad. It's slightly over the top, and it's full of fantastic insights. Because Burgess was, as well as he was a deeply reflective. He's a writer's writer, and he would have had an understanding of Shakespeare, the writer, um, through his own gifts. And I think his reading of the mysterious character of William Shakespeare is very much one of his great achievements.
Yeah, he projects, I think, something of himself onto Shakespeare. He decides, I think, from the references to spaniels, that Shakespeare was not a dog lover, and he decides as well that he had a fine tenor voice. And I've always suspected that this is Burgess maybe introducing elements of himself into the portrait there.
I think we all do that. I mean, everyone who writes about Shakespeare ends up finding a little bit of Shakespeare, which is a kind of vanity, but it's quite an entertaining vanity. But I think that Burgess's intuition about, particularly his end. I mean, I quote his Burgess's summary of Shakespeare's end, his last years, and I think it's very much on the money. About the sense that he wasn't a vain man. He didn't consider himself to be he didn't need to have acclamation. He just faded away.
You also quote Borges to the effect that Shakespeare is many people and no one, and that raises again the question of whether or not we can ever know Shakespeare, or if it's always a case of projecting our own preoccupations onto him.
He is a mirror, in the way that a composer of genius like Mozart is a kind of a mirror, and we see ourselves in these artists of great genius. That's their gift to us in a way, and I don't think we'll ever, of course, we're never going to find his letters or his diaries. That chance is long gone, and so he's somebody we can intuit. Through the fragments that are left behind.
Back in the 1990s, I can remember from being a student, we had this image of Shakespeare as transgressive, subversive, anti-establishment. And then reading more widely, you see that he's also been identified as a pillar of the establishment, someone who set out to legitimize the Tudor monarchy. I wonder how you would reconcile these very different political Shakespeares who've emerged through writing about him.
There's a political Shakespeare, there's the personal Shakespeare, there's the theatrical Shakespeare, there's the reclusive. He's a man of parts, and if you pitch him into the court, you see that the public Shakespeare. When you see him with the sonnets, you see the private man. And I think when I think about Shakespeare, I think about someone who I knew quite well, someone like Seamus. I knew Burgess as well, but he's not quite the same character. But Seamus Heaney, who was a very, very famous public poet in Ireland, and handled that. I mean, I saw him handle it on a number of occasions with great grace and brilliance. Was also a deeply private man, and could be he could be very reflective and thoughtful and quiet. And I think that Shakespeare was somebody who, when he was on stage, or when he was in the arena of the Globe, or in the arena of the court, or with his fellow playwrights in a bar in Southwark, a pub in Southwark, he'd be one kind of character, and when he was sitting at his desk, he was another. He was different. So I think he's infinitely various.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the poems and the sonnets, which sometimes get overlooked by people who are in search of Shakespeare. Burgess too took that as his starting point. The plot of Nothing Like the Sun is in many ways, it's built around this narrative that he discovers in the sonnets. I wonder if there's a distinction that you would draw between the Shakespeare of the narrative poems and the sonnets and the love poems, as against this dramatic series of voices, these monologues and dialogues that you find in the plays.
Well, I think there's some truth in that, but there's also the fact that what he does in the long poems is he treats the poems like a play, and so the drama of the sonnets is a dramatic drama, which he almost dramatizes, but doesn't quite. And in Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis, they are full of these set piece scenes. I mean, they're poetry, but they're dramatic scenes, and he is somebody who instinctively creates drama wherever he goes out of everyday life. So I think, in a way, I wouldn't really set these two positions together. I'd say that they're two sides of the same coin, really.
You begin the book with Marlowe and the discovery in Cambridge of this portrait, which is thought to be potentially a portrait of Christopher Marlowe, and your father's involvement in that discovery. And Burgess, too, as we know, was fascinated by Marlowe and got another novel out of him, the Dead Man in Deptford, towards the end of his life. And it's very interesting to make that comparison, as you do, between Marlowe, who was enormous news clearly in his lifetime, and yet Shakespeare has come to eclipse him and his reputation. And you also suggest that Shakespeare was in some sense quite haunted by Marlowe and his example. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about the way in which, or the reasons why, Shakespeare has become this great cultural monument, and Marlowe, though he's not unknown, doesn't really occupy the same stature within our culture.
He's been eclipsed, although at the point at which he dies, as I've said in the book, the point at which he's killed, he is a theatrical and poetic superstar in a way that Shakespeare wasn't. And lots of people have said, including Stanley Wells, the Shakespeare scholar, if Shakespeare had died at the same time that Marlowe had died, we'd remember Marlowe. So what you have is that, the ironies of the vicissitudes of literary posterity. Marlowe in his lifetime was this gigantic figure, the man really who invented Elizabethan theatre. It was Shakespeare who then sort of put it to work and brought it to life. And I think the big difference between them, although there are lots of similarities in their backgrounds. I mean, Marlowe grew up in Canterbury, he was the son of an artisan, whether Shakespeare grew up in Stratford, was the son of a glove maker. Marlowe's father was a cobbler. And there are lots of similarities, but the big difference is that Marlowe goes to Cambridge, and the story behind the portrait, which you've alluded to, is that's all true. We don't know that it was. I mean, there is the strong suggestion it was him, but there's no proof. He's just a young man in fashionable clothing, with a Latin epigraph attached. But going to Cambridge cut him off from, as it were, the vernacular. It pitched him into a world of Latin and Greek themes and ideas and models. And so he became classicized in a way that Shakespeare always remains a man of the people. Marlowe goes to court, becomes a spy, and he's steeped in the classics. His plays are shot through with classical tags, and his plays themselves are quite static. I mean, dramatically. Shakespeare is always mobile, and that's because he inhabits the lives of the characters on stage in a way that Marlowe doesn't. In a Shakespeare play, every character he's attuned to the inner lives of all the characters, and you can read, the third murderer, or the second Ostler in Henry IV, whatever it is. You can look at these tiny characters, and they all have characters. Marlowe doesn't do that. He has these really cardboard figures who declaim fantastic poetry, but it doesn't relate to everyone's experience. Is the difference. Shakespeare is very much grounded in the reality of everyday life. He lives in the city. He lives in the heart of the city of London. He's beset by all kinds of perils, and he knows what ordinary life is like. And Marlowe doesn't deal with that, and that's the big difference.
You at various points in the book, you write about the portraits of Shakespeare, which have survived. Some of them speculative. There's obviously the grave sculpture in Stratford as well. What can we learn from reading these? Are they texts which help us to understand the work, or are they in some sense red herrings, do you think?
Well, I think every generation will find a Shakespeare image that they want to. Currently, the so-called Chandos portrait is the one with the earring, is the popular one. because he seems to us more contemporary. He feels like somebody you could meet in the street, and he's quite raffish and slightly foreign looking, and there's no proof that it's him, and it doesn't bear much relationship to the other 6 portraits that we know about. One of the problems is that because he predeceases the editors of the first folio, and indeed many of the actors that he had worked with and developed his career with at the Globe, is that there was a small group of people in the late 1610s and early 1620s who would have had a pretty clear idea of what he was like. So that, for example, when the first folio is published and there's the Martin Drurschott image on the title page, this is an image which was commissioned by people who remembered Shakespeare, and so it might have been a bad likeness, but it's still a kind of a likeness, and that's the big difference, is that all the images that date up to the 1620s, and there are 3 of them, I think, not all of them by any means, and then there are copies which get passed on later on. All those early images, they bear them. They would have passed the sort of sniff test amongst Shakespeare's contemporaries. They'd say, "Oh, that Will wasn't like that," but they can see what the artist is getting at. Marlowe, we have no idea what he was like.
It's very interesting with the portraits. When Burgess is looking at the sculpture on Shakespeare's tomb, he says this man was obviously an idiot who had syphilis as well, and he's constructing a biography out of what he sees. Now, when you look at the great monument of scholarship that's accrued around Shakespeare, some of the editions where there are maybe 1 or 2 lines of text at the top of the page and then a double column of learned footnotes beneath, does that inspire you? Does that depress you? How helpful do you find the huge monument of scholarship that's now?
Yeah, well, I think all those. I mean, the Arden edition is the one which is stuffed full of those kinds of footnotes, and you always find nuggets. There are always things there to delight and entertain. But it is angels dancing on the head of a pin. It's an obsession with the minutiae of the work, and not it doesn't look at the big picture. I mean, it's trying to elucidate the mysteries of the text, and there are text that is very, very clotted with meaning, and clotted with allusion and reference and topicality. I mean, he was somebody who was writing right to the moment in every play he wrote. Virtually every play has got. I've mentioned Midsummer Night's Dream. Midsummer Night's Dream probably came out in 1595 after A Very Bad Summer, and the bad summer is in the play. When Essex heads off to Ireland in 1599, there's a reference to that in Henry V. He never misses an opportunity to make a topical reference to appeal to a contemporary audience. So he's very attuned to the moment, and I think those footnotes you describe, and there are so many of them, speaks to that. And they give academics. I mean, academics perform a very important function, but they're not. They're never going to bring back the experience of the play in the moment. The director does that, not the scholar.
You spoke earlier about the Englishness of Shakespeare, as against Marlowe's Latinity, perhaps. And I wonder if you think of his work as being English or being universal. I mean, how well do the plays travel into different cultures and different languages?
They get performed all over the world. Literally. I mean, a play like Hamlet crops up in Arab cultures, Japanese cultures, Russian, you name it, everywhere, because they are universal. These are universal themes, and he provides so they're universal themes, but they're English in their sympathy and their taste, and that's the nice combination. I didn't really go into this in the book, but they're these very big themes, but they're refracted through a certain quality of mind, which I would characterize as English, which is there's a kind of sympathy, there's a democratic spirit, a libertarian spirit, a generosity towards the common man and woman, which I would think of as a very typical English. And it's a sympathy inspired by a life which had begun in a small country town in the middle of England. He knew ordinary people, and he knew ordinary people, and he wrote for ordinary people, and he wrote for decent, good people who went to the play and who wanted to see something of that on the stage. At the same time, it would be wrapped up in these extraordinary visceral dramas of hatred and greed and so forth, and destruction. So all the plays are both one thing and another at the same time.
There's clearly a great enthusiasm for people to seek out Shakespeare. I was in Stratford not long ago, and standing outside Shakespeare's house, watching the people coming and going and having their selfies taken and going into the house. And it got me thinking, are you ever going to find him there in the house where he grew up, or is it in the theatre? I mean, what approach would you recommend for a reader who wanted to seek him out?
As you were saying earlier on, there are many Shakespeare. There's the domestic Shakespeare, there's the public theatrical Shakespeare, there's the private poet, there's the dramatist who would give the epilogue at the end of the play. There's a man who's used to standing in front of a big crowd. There's a man who is used to talking to a noble in a corridor in Whitehall. There are many different. He has many different lives, and I think to find, one of the things that we all love to do now when we go to festivals and so forth is we love to see the writer in three. We get a three-dimensional encounter with a writer in a festival. And when we look for Shakespeare, that's the kind of thing we're trying to achieve. It's a will o' the wisp. I mean, he's long gone, and actually, the world in which he grew up in is, and I've made this point at the beginning when I'm talking about Marlowe, is so foreign to us in a way that the world of Milton is not so foreign, which is only 50 years later, is not so foreign. The world of Milton and Dryden and the Restoration playwrights is a million miles from the world of Shakespeare and Marlowe. And something happened at the turn of the 16th, 17th century. And it's a step change. It's a really significant shift in consciousness, ideas, technology, all kinds of philosophy, science, money, capitalism. All these things change in the year 1600 to 1620. So by the time he's dead, the world in which he'd grown up in, the world in which he was partly writing about, a world of mystery and superstition and incredible violence and cruelty, is gone, and darkness.
You've said this is not a book for academics and scholars, though you hope they might learn something from looking at it. What kind of reader do you have in mind for Shakespearean?
Well, I think someone like you, Andrew, in a funny way, who you're not a Shakespeare scholar, I don't think. You're a scholar, but the generally interested reader, people that like many of my friends who would go to the occasional play, who are interested. I mean, I'm struck by how interested people are in Shakespeare, and it's a book for them. Really, it's a book celebrating his Englishness, celebrating his extraordinary variety and his genius. I mean, at the end of the day, the thing that we're left sort of skirting around at the bottom of is this. It's like I think Henry James used the image somewhere, but it's like you're standing at the foot of a tree, and you can just about walk around the trunk of the tree, but above you are branches and branches and branches and leaves, a multiplicity, a profusion of growth and liveliness and activity, which you can never begin to encompass.
Well, one of the things I've enjoyed about reading your book is your obvious enthusiasm for the material, and also the way that you've framed quite well-known narratives, but reframed them in a way that's very arresting and fresh to rediscover. A writer you thought you knew, but plainly, I didn't know him as well as you do.
Well, I think he is there to be found, and I could probably pick up the collected works in a year's time and find a whole other narrative, which I've missed this time round. But I think I'm done. I think what I've done is I'm quite pleased with good chunks of it, not all of it by any means. I think you put your finger on the Brexit stuff is sort of inevitable, but also it's crowd pleasing, but it's also quite trivial. I think, but there are things in there which are not trivial, but which are sort of deeper. And I particularly thought I liked the end of it. I felt like when I got to writing the end, writing about him at the end, I felt as though I sort of knew him better than I had done at the beginning. So that in that sense, there was a journey I'd been on. But everyone goes on their own journey with him, and the extraordinary thing is, he is our national poet, playwright, and he is somebody of astonishing grandeur and importance.
Well, I think this book certainly deserves its place on the same shelf as the Burgess Shakespeare biography.
Oh, thank you very much. That's good enough for me. I mean, I'll take that. If it can sit next to Anthony Burgess and hold its head up next to his biography, which of course, as you well know, had quite a history to it behind it, not least but being possibly being the basis for a film, which never happened. But if it can be put next to anything that Burgess wrote about Shakespeare, I shall be very, very pleased.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you about it.
Thank you, Andrew, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, I hope.
You have been listening to the International Anthony Burgess Foundation Podcast. Robert McCrum's book Shakespearean, on life and language in times of disruption, is published by Picador and available now in all good bookshops. For more information about the Burgess Foundation and Anthony Burgess, visit www.anthonyburgess.org.